זה כן סגר את ה... זה סגר את ה...
אוקיי, עכשיו אני לא יכול לעצור את ההקלטה.
אוקיי, אני יכול. We're live.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us to this webinar with Ian Lustick. I'm Tamir Sorek, I'm a professor at the Department of History at Penn State University. And with me hosting the meeting, Professor Lior Sternfeld from the same department. It is my pleasure to host here Ian Lustick today. Until his recent retirement, Ian Lustick was the Bess Ayman Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He is very well known for his studies on Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, on Jewish fundamentalism in Israel, and on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a comparative perspective. In 2006, he became even more broadly known with the publication of his book, Trapped in a War on Terror, in which he argues that the war on terrorism is an irrational policy for fighting America's enemies. Lustick is also a recipient of several prestigious awards, including the Carnegie Corporation, the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Social Sciences Research Council. In 1985, Lustick was one of the founders and later the president of the Association for Israel Studies, an organization that has gone through significant transformation since then, and in which Lustick is surprisingly enough still a member. His most recent book, Paradigm Lost, both shapes and reflects the drastic changes in the field of Israel studies. And I invite you now to hear Ian Lustick talking about it. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Tamir. I'd like to know, well, who am I talking to? I can see you and Lior, but I can't see anyone else.
We have 7 participants. And
okay. These students,
I see some faculty.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are some students too.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm delighted to be here, as it were. Someday soon, I hope to visit College Park and be there in person. But this is better than not being able to talk to you at all. I have a PowerPoint, which is not got a lot of slides. It will quickly let me go through the argument of the book. And then I'm looking forward to comments, questions, discussion. So let's get started. I'm asking Lior if he will share his screen with the PowerPoint. I'm not seeing it yet. Lior?
Can you see it now?
No, I just see an arrow pointing upward.
Just a second.
We saw it before.
On screen.
Just a second. It's like now we're running through all the problems that we, just a second.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yes, I can.
Oh.
Okay, Lior, so this is the title of the book, Paradigm Lost, From TwoState Solution to OneState Reality. And you can see there's a web page dedicated to the book where I keep posting not only reviews and interviews, but also articles and commentary from others that highlight the dynamics of the one-state reality as time goes forward. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to check out that website. You can also, of course, order the book usually at a discount through that website. Okay, next slide, please. So you've often seen in books epigrams at the beginning, which seem cryptic and hard to understand. I have 2 epigrams at the beginning of this book, and I'm going to explain what they are and why I have them at the beginning of the book. One is a verse from a Leonard Cohen poem, sounded like the truth, seemed the better way, sounded like the truth, but it's not the truth today. That is a reference, from my point of view, to the two-state solution, which for decades, to me and to many others, really sounded like the truth as far as how peace between Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel could be achieved. It certainly seemed like the better way. That's not what Leonard Cohen's poem was about. It was a more general poem, but that's not the truth today. It is no longer the better way. In fact, it has dangers to pursue something which is impossible, has serious dangers, which I will try to highlight. So that's one epigram. The other is a Yiddish proverb that I learned from my grandfather, man tracht und Gott lacht, man plans and God laughs, which is really a reference to unintended consequences. And my book argues that both how we got here, which is to say, how we got to a place where the one promising solution that seemed available has disappeared, and where this situation is going, both of those questions are answered mainly by understanding the unintended consequences of projects that are designed to do something. So no one, I'm arguing, ever designed what we have now. Nobody tried to implement and achieve as their optimal outcome what we see now. Not on the right, not on the left, not in the middle, no one. It is an unintended consequence of partial successes and partial failures of many interacting projects. And if we want to understand where this situation is going, not in a couple months or a couple years, but in a couple decades or a couple generations, that same kind of logic, the logic of unintended consequences and the legacies of partially successful projects interacting with one another, that's what we have to understand. I'm showing you a picture of the book on the right in English. It actually just recently appeared in Hebrew with the same cover. Of course, the title is in Hebrew. Now, could we have the next slide, please? So ask yourself this question. If you see that red arrow pointing to the land between the river and the sea, which is highlighted by both the Jewish star and Palestinian keffiyeh. What is this thing between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea? That question, when you say what is something, that is an ontological question. That's a question about what is it that exists. It's a very basic philosophical concept, ontology. What's the basic thing that exists? What is this? Now, if you can click the screen so we could advance the animation, Lior, just yes. That is, as I said, an ontological question. Think about it. When you look at that area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, do you see it as the state of Israel within the green line, within the 1949 armistice lines, plus the territories that Israel has held or dominated since 1967, namely the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights? Or is this thing which you're looking at, is it the state of Israel? With ruling different territories in different ways, but it's all one state. And what my book really is saying, look, this is not a state and territories that are not the state. This is, the whole thing is one state now. It has been for quite a while. And when you look at it that way, the problem and the opportunities to move forward change dramatically. Next slide. So what is an ontological question? To be clear on this, for example, if somebody asks, which people have asked, what is fire? What is fire? That's an ontological question. Well, the answer to the question depends on your deep philosophy. If you operate within an Aristotelian world, where the world is made up of four basic elements, fire, earth, air, and water, then fire is a basic element. It's a thing. It is a thing itself. But in the world of modern chemistry, fire is not a thing. Please click. For most of human history, between Aristotle and the theory of combustion in the 18th century, it was believed that fire was a thing inside of wood, for example, and it was called by medieval and early modern scientists phlogiston. And this phlogiston got released as fire. It took centuries for scientists to show that there was nothing called phlogiston, and that actually when wood burned, it didn't weigh more, it didn't weigh less because the phlogiston was released, it weighed more. And that could only be explained eventually by a completely different ontological view of fire. Next, just click. And that was the theory of combustion, which argues that fire is an effect, is a kind of plasma thing that arises out of interactions between fuel and oxygen and heat. It's a completely different way to see what fire is. Now, that kind of ontological question, that is a deep, difficult switch. People resist making a switch like that. They don't even think the world is understandable. In fact, it took hundreds of years and lots, way more evidence than it should have before the phlogiston theory was put to rest and it was replaced by modern chemistry. Next slide, please. 39, actually more like 40 years ago, 41 years ago, I was very interested in this problem. I've been actually engaged in studying Palestinian-Israeli relations since 1969, when I was in Israel and in Palestine for 6 months. I wrote my first published paper then, appeared in Jewish Frontier in 1970. So I've been watching this problem for a long time. And I remember very well in the early 80s that the big debate among Israelis and Palestinians, that is 40 years ago, was, are there so many settlers in the West Bank that pretty soon the idea of Israeli withdrawal and a two-state solution will be absolutely impossible? And the question that Meron Ben-Vinisti made famous was, is it 5 minutes to midnight? And Ben-Vinisti was the most, an Israeli geographer and sociologist, former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, who died recently. He was the most quoted Israeli analyst in the New York Times for years. This is what he said in 1983. Within 36 months, there'll be 100,000 Jewish inhabitants of the West Bank. If this occurs, it will become impossible for any Israeli government to relinquish control. Around the same time, another noted Israeli analyst, Amos Alon, wrote, for all practical purposes, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza have already been annexed to the state of Israel, perhaps irrevocably. This is 40 years ago. Yehuda Litani, one of the Haaretz's top journalists covering the West Bank, within just 7 weeks, negotiating initiatives for a territorial compromise could be irrelevant. Danny Rubenstein, also, along with Yehuda Litani, the top West Palestinian affairs journalists, there is no chance that Israel will be able to give up as much as 1 meter in the West Bank, even if it wishes to do so. This is January 1982. Shmuel Toledano, a well-known advisor on Arab affairs to the Israeli government, a moderate in labor circles, within a few years, he said, if anyone were to suggest giving up any part of the territories, it would be regarded as no different than that of giving up the Negev or the Galilee. Hirsch Goodman, a Jerusalem Post analyst, in 83, for anyone who has spent even a little time on the West Bank recently, when there were at that time, by the way, about 30,000 settlers, maybe 25,000, it must have become obvious that de facto annexation has taken place. Now, all of that took place 40 years ago, where people are saying, if the point of no return hasn't passed already, it will pass within a few weeks. And I can show you, and have shown, Palestinian and Arab spokesmen said the same thing. But then look at John Kerry, Secretary of State John Kerry, in spring of 2013, when President Obama allowed him, although Obama never believed it would work, allowed him to launch a peace initiative. He said to the Congress, I believe the window for a two-state solution is shutting. Of course, it had been shutting for apparently for 40 years. I think we have some period of time, 1.5 to 2 years, or it's over. Well, of course, Kerry's initiative failed. And after those 2 years were up, he didn't declare that it was over. So what's interesting here is this never-ending story of an apparent point of no return, so much settlement, so much integration of the West Bank, that we might as well stop talking about a two-state solution, and it never seems to arrive. It's like Zeno's paradox. You never quite get there. Next slide, please. Now, in fact, the point of no return, which is the point in an airplane, if an airplane is flying from San Francisco to Honolulu and it runs into a mechanical problem, the point of no return is when it's more than halfway to Honolulu, it must continue. It can't go back to San Francisco. So that's what a point of no return is. The point of no return in this debate is the point at which Israel has incorporated the territories to such an extent that they're part of Israel and there is no chance of a negotiated two-state solution. Now, instead of a few tens of thousands of Israeli Jews living across the Green Line or in the West Bank beyond East Jerusalem, about 1 out of 11 Israeli Jews, 1 out of all 11, out of all Israeli Jews, 1 out of 11 live across the Green Line. The Oslo zones that are familiar to us, area A, area B, area A is brown, area B is yellow on this map, area C, Israeli controlled completely, is light brown. These Oslo zones are familiar, but the reality is that you have in the West Bank now an archipelago of ghettos for lower caste inhabitants who are surrounded and enclosed by somewhat permeable now, barriers and closures. And as the French used to say in Algeria, around the Kasbah, when they wanted to go into the Kasbah, they called it a rat hunt. They went in to kill or capture particular wanted terrorists. Israel does that anywhere, at any time in the West Bank, area C, area B, or area A. So those autonomy areas are not really autonomous at all. In fact, although I won't go into it, we can talk about this at the question period, discussion period, I consider the Palestinian Authority to be the equivalent of Israel's Arab Department for Judea and Samaria. And that goes back to the time when in every ministry in Israel, Arabs went not to the actual ministry, they went to an Arab department of the Israel ministry that was headed by a Jew but staffed by Arabs. So in that way, the coordinator for administering the civil administration in the territories is in effect the director of the Arab department of Judea and Samaria, and Abu Mazen and his security forces and so on report to him. This map, this particular map, if you look closely at it, you can see a line going down from Jenin all the way to Tarkumia. That is a plan for a railway to link Afula in the north to Kiryat Gat in the south along the mountain ridge. This is just to show that a normal planning document that Israel uses completely treats the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, as part of its infrastructure for the future. Next slide, please. In fact, if we ask what is the truth today, is it a state that controls territories that are not in the state, or is it one state called Israel, which may rule different territories with different populations in different ways? Well, there's a distinction that Wittgenstein made, a famous philosopher, between the grammar of language and ordinary language. Grammar is what you say when you're trying to speak properly. Ordinary languages are the sentences that we use when we talk without thinking about the right way to speak, but it's our natural way of speaking. And way to see what a country really thinks is not to look at its official diplomatic maps, because they're carefully, although you can learn from them, look at the maps that they use for everyday purposes and see how they naturally, in ordinary language, portray the shape of Israel. So here we see on the left a map from a book called Hiking in Israel. And you can see that there are no real distinctions between Samaria, Judea, Negev, any Galilee, any other, or even Gaza. Then you can see the weather map, the same thing. There are no borders. If you look closely at the map of topography on the right, you might say, oh, well, there's a line that separates Gaza, what is referred to in the Israeli press all the time as the coastal enclave. But if you look closely at the lines, you'll see that that is not an international border. The international border goes only between Egypt and Israel. Next slide, please. On the left, you can see a map taken from the Israel Statistical Abstract or a similar document of internal migration. Where did Israelis move from one region to another last year? How many Israelis moved from this region to that region? And you'll notice that the West Bank, Judea and Samaria are completely considered a part of an internal migration pattern. Okay, next slide, please. Now, my book's divided into two parts, really. The first few chapters try to say, how is it that we got to this point? The second part explores the dynamics of being there. So the first three chapters try to explain the series of unintended consequences that led to Israel's transformation, because it's a mistake to think that it's only because of the settlements in the West Bank that the point of no return has changed. Those settlements, which I've paid a lot of attention to, are only part, they're only a symptom, really. The really important point is that Israel itself has changed. In more than a half a century, Israel has transformed. And that transformation includes a deep political transformation, ideological, sociological, that has embedded the entire territory between the river and the sea into a political unit called the State of Israel. So the way I try to explain it, especially to American audiences, is to say that in the 50s and early 60s, one can, in some respects, see Israel as a kind of democratic socialist state. It was kind of Massachusetts, a deeply blue state. In the 70s, 80s, it became a purple state. You had Likud and Labor battling over whether the national camp or the peace camp were going to control the future of the country. It went back and forth very narrowly. But by the end of the 90s, certainly by the end of the Second Intifada in the 2000s and 2010s, Israel has become a deeply red state. It's more like Oklahoma or Nebraska. It's not Ohio, certainly not Massachusetts. Now, how did this happen? Very quickly, because this is a complicated part of the book and it relies an awful lot on the extensive documentation that I provided. There are three mechanisms that produce this. One is what I call the flaw in the iron wall, which was the iron wall strategy was a brilliant Zionist attempt in the mandate period, agreed upon by both Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky, though Jabotinsky came up with the idea or with the formula, that the Arabs would never and should really never, from their own point of view, agree to Zionism, agree to what the Zionists wanted, which was a state in as much of Palestine as possible. But if the Jews defeated the Arabs enough times, some of them would give up. And there would be a split in the Arab world. And when there was that split between moderates and extremists, those willing to take half a loaf and those who weren't willing to take half a loaf, Zionism could reach out and negotiate a solution, a compromise with the moderates and isolate the extremists. That was the theory that both Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky advanced insofar as they ever had a theory for how peace would be achieved. And they did in that way. However, there was a flaw in the theory because the strategy assumed that the Arabs would change, they would split and become more moderate after losing war after war, but that the Jews would remain just as sensible, as rational. They would not change after winning war after war. But in fact, that's not, the Jews are normal, just as the Arabs are. And when a people or a person wins all the time and suffers by doing it, or they come to believe that they should get even more. Why, as Shamir and others have often said, what's burning? Maza Boer. Why should we compromise? Why should we give them at the diplomatic table what they can't get in the battlefield? So Israeli, as Arab demands over the decades shrank, Israeli politics produced more extreme maximalist demands. That was the flaw in the iron wall that led to an extremization of Israeli political demands once the Six-Day War presented the opportunity to maintain control over all of the land of Israel. Another chapter is devoted to the way the catastrophe of the Holocaust has been remembered collectively in Israel. And this is a complicated and sensitive topic. I go into several different ways that Israeli political culture tried to process and understand and remember the Holocaust. One of those became hegemonic. And that was the one pushed by Menachem Begin in the 1960s and 70s. And that is that the Holocaust is all you really need to know about being Jewish in the world, that all Gentiles are potential Nazis, and no one must ever forget that. And therefore, anything that looks like it could lead to a threat to Jews must be treated as if it held the seeds for the unleashing of a Nazi Holocaust again. And that made all non-Jews, but particularly Palestinians, suspect. It made them look like Nazis in Israeli political culture. And it made it extraordinarily difficult to win politically by advancing compromise solutions with Gentiles, not to say, of course, with Arabs. One of the points I make in this chapter, in order to try to convey what the argument is that the Holocaust, by being remembered and systematically reproduced over and over again through trips to concentration camps and so on by school children, creates multitudes of hyperlinks inside the minds of Israelis, in fact, most Jews, so that whenever one hears the word barbed wire or crematorium or even carbon monoxide or truck, all of this thoughts of the Holocaust or trains come to mind. And that keeps that Holocaust, that's why I call it Holocausty. It's a kind of enveloping culture. The third, and I'm not saying that the purpose of any of that was to make Israelis less likely to make peace with the Palestinians. It's the unintended consequence of the success that Begin and others had coming to power in that way. The third chapter has to do with the way that the lobby in the United States, especially AIPAC, the Israel lobby, by its purpose was to prevent the United States from pressuring Israel, to let Israel do what its democratically chosen government wanted to do. But the result, unintendedly, of the extreme success of AIPAC was to create a political situation in Israel in which the left would be inevitably defeated every time it argued that now is the time to make peace, even though we don't have to, because eventually the world will force us to. And since the United States never really applied the pressure that would be necessary for the dovish argument to work, it incentivized all politicians in Israel, if they were going to win elections, to move to the right, to increase the reliance on fantasy and on fear in order to, and on the principle that Jews could get whatever they wanted. All they had to do was assert themselves. And the lobby actually produced that deflection of Israeli politics from the direction in which it might otherwise have gone. So you put all those three things together and you can explain why we have this situation now of a one-state reality that is not, of course, a democratic state. Let's look at the next slide, please. Now, I have talked about the two-state solution being, let's say, dead for a long time, but no one wanting to actually acknowledge it. There was a bit of humor in the book that I try to bring out, and this is it, because I'm arguing that not only is the two-state solution itself dead, but the very metaphor that is dead is dead. And I try to show this back in 2019 when I published the book by quoting from all these pundits who say one version or another of the same thing, and they say it over and over, no matter how many years go by. So let's just read quickly through this. Since the Second Intifada, a question and a metaphor have come to dominate public discussion of the TSS, that is the two-state solution. The question that hangs above its advocates like a sword of Damocles is whether de facto annexation has rendered the project impossible or so implausible that the entire paradigm of separating the West Bank from Israel as a route to peace must be abandoned. The prevailing metaphor is death. Has the TSS died? These are all quotes from pundits or from politicians. Is it on life support? Is it dying but not dead? Or is it dead but not buried? Or is it dead as a dodo? Did the United States give the TSS the kiss of death when it recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital? Or was that act its death knell? There is no doubt that TSS is definitely in trouble, if not on its deathbed. Or is it in a death spiral? Should it be allowed to die a natural death? Is it dead or is it long dead and decomposing? Or perhaps it should be considered almost dead and closer to death every day. Is it in trouble but not dead? Did the TSS die or was it put to death? Can we see signs of possible life or only the reflexive twitching a dead body can sometimes exhibit? Should we say it isn't dead, but it is dying, that it is stuck but not dead? If it is dying, perhaps the TSS can be rescued and resuscitated. A major 2013 symposium in the Jewish periodical Moment magazine was titled, "Is the Two-State Solution Dead?" Instructively, 4 years later, the New York Times published a long article with the same title and effectively the same analysis, and that is still happening. Next slide, please. So we are in the one-state reality. One of the reasons why I am urging people to see that is because it's boring to keep saying the same thing over and over again when it doesn't get you anywhere. It's really why I wrote this book. Is I was a two-state advocate for decades. I actually organized a petition campaign among Jews throughout the world in 1971-72. In favor of a non-belligerent Palestinian state and an end to settlement in the occupied territories. That was when there were only 1,300 settlers in the West Bank. The Golda Meir government ignored us, though the West Bank press did take note of us, so did Shulamit Aloni and a few others. But it took me decades before I finally realized that what I had always hoped and wanted, I would not come about, not through negotiations, not in my lifetime for sure. And I found myself, instead of saying things that other people found interesting, or even if they found them shocking, they found them interesting, I was always 10 or 15 years ahead of the curve, trying to understand where things were going. And now all of a sudden I heard myself repeating the same slogans and the same ideas that got me nowhere. Once I flipped my perception of the situation and realized that this is already a one-state reality, I can see much more. My thinking is much more interesting to me and to others. And I want others to see that that is true for them as well. They don't have to feel bored and despairing and stuck and eye rolling at every single development that occurs. You know the story of the frog. The frog doesn't know that it's dying and the water gets warm and boiling too slowly. The water has boiled. The political environment has changed. Many frogs have died and others are dying. That is, many ideas associated with the two-state solution and with the idea of the possibility of territorial withdrawal are gone. But other species, other kinds of things can survive in this new one-state reality. We see that, for example, with the new government in Israel, the government that is for the first time really a Jewish Arab government. But it will take decades and generations for the realignments and new strategies to completely emerge. It implies a drastic change in assumptions about relevant timeframes and the role of blueprints and the concept of a solution. I don't think in terms of months or years. Will the United States put pressure on Israel? Will a new government come into power that will have a peace coalition? Will Abu Mazen agree to land swaps? None of that is relevant. Absolutely. Will E1 be settled? Doesn't matter anymore. There are already enough settlements in the West Bank with other things to prevent withdrawal. Another settlement here or there doesn't matter. It's, in fact, from a Palestinian point of view, it might be preferable to taking land away from Negev Bedouin or Palestinians who live in the Galilee. We have to think that the role of blueprints and the concept of a solution is not what we thought it was. It's not that problems like this are solved by really smart people figuring out clever ways to finesse the demands of deeply conflicted parties and then implement that delicate, carefully worked out blueprint. That's not how these situations change. I challenge any of you in the audience to come up with an example of a problem like the Israel-Palestine problem where that occurred. I personally think maybe the odds, there's a miracle that the odds were as high as they were that it could have occurred. I do think the two-state solution could have been achieved, maybe with a 25% probability in the 1990s, but it wasn't. Instead, we think that blueprints are important because they organize projects that then fail in particular ways, and the legacy of those failures interact with one another to produce a new situation. Still, we can see a variety of signs of drastic change and struggles by different actors to acclimate to this new situation. Next slide. For example, we saw the Trump plan come forward, which had some very interesting aspects to it. It was, of course, completely phony as far as a two-state solution. It's still interesting that it had to pay lip service to a two-state solution, even when it was obviously implemented to prevent anything like that. But for example, one very interesting thing about it was that part of the Negev was to be turned over to Palestinian refugees from the Gaza Strip. This is the first time any government in Israel has said positive things about a plan that involved the return into the Green Line area of multitudes of Palestinian refugees. And that's because it really is a one-state reality, but no one wants to say it that way. But let's ask what this whole campaign about annexation might mean. Because a lot of people get afraid, oh my God, they're going to annex, and that will, well, what's the problem with that? Will that prevent a two-state solution? No, that's already been prevented. What might it do? Well, when you think about what it might do, you realize why it wasn't done, why no announcement to annex was made, and why any government that we can imagine in the near future will not formally annex the West Bank. First of all, if it means permanent incorporation, annexation has already occurred. If it means that Israelis living in the West Bank are living under Israeli law, that's also almost entirely occurred because of the formula that is attached to almost every law the Knesset passes, that Israelis living in Judea and Samaria are being treated under this law as if they are living in Israel. If it is referred to as annexation or sovereignty, but is actually only the extension of Israeli administration, law, and jurisdiction, which is the language that in their more careful wording, Netanyahu and others have used, it's a new description of apartheid, but one that is slightly less silent about itself. That formula is what was used to incorporate expanded East Jerusalem and the Golan, not to annex per se or to declare sovereignty, which was never done, but to extend the municipal boundaries of the city of Yerushalayim so that Israeli administration, law, and jurisdiction applied, but not citizenship. If If they had been formally annexed to the sovereign state of Israel, then you would have had, as you did in the Galilee, create a situation of forced citizenship, which of course was not wanted. Now, one reason why annexation is unlikely to be implemented by the Likud government in anything more than a decorative way is just precisely because it has the potential of opening up productive struggles by Jews and Palestinians for equal rights, democracy, and mutual rights to non-exclusivist self-determination. Next slide. Now, I actually don't want to, I want to bring my remarks to a conclusion. I only want to point out that it's here in East Jerusalem, where the point of this last argument becomes most sharp and where we may see the future earliest. There are 350,000 Palestinians living in the boundaries of the city of Yerushalayim, which is that red line you see on the map. That red line was drawn somewhat in 1967 by the Israeli government. So all the green areas within that red line are Palestinian neighborhoods. All the blue areas are Jewish settlements. Those Arabs living there are not Israeli citizens, but they are citizens of the city of Jerusalem, and they have the right to vote in municipal elections. The Palestinian Authority and the PLO have told them for decades, don't vote because you will approve the occupation. But increasingly, Palestinians who know the occupation, as it were, is not going to end, want equal rights inside the city. They want services. They want to be treated fairly. And they want a mayor who will do that. So they would like to vote in Jerusalem elections. Polls show that almost 45% of them wanted to vote in the last one. If only a fraction of those had voted, we would have a completely different mayor in Jerusalem today. In fact, many Arabs did vote, but not nearly enough to swing the balance, even though the difference was only about 4,000 votes. Why didn't they vote? Because the Palestinian Authority threatened and intimidated very clearly large numbers of Palestinians in East Jerusalem not to vote, because it's in the Palestinian Authority's interest to maintain a situation, not where they have any chance of getting a two-state solution, but where the international community continues to pay them $400 million a year to keep the problem where it is. That helps the 25,000 families who live, and actually probably more than that, live with the largesse of the Palestinian Authority, and of course it helps Israel. So, but at some point, and I think we're going to see more and more Arabs voting in every election, this is going to be a crucial proving ground for how moderate Jews and Palestinian Arabs can link together in coalitions which can completely change the complexion of politics in Jerusalem and eventually in Israel as a whole. And I think I'll stop there and open up the occasion for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Ian. If you have questions, feel free to type them on the Q&A feature, and we'll present the speaker with the questions.
We can also allow them to talk if it's possible.
All right.
So I saw one hand.
Yeah.
Here.
Farzin, do you? Let's.
You have to unmute.
Farzin?
Maybe, do you have to unmute him?
I cannot unmute. I can only request.
Yeah, she can unmute. We can't.
All right.
Okay,
So,
I will ask a question if. Thank you, Jan. Well, I've read the book, so I'm familiar with the content, and I have a question which is a disciplinary academic question.
since as political units, Israel and Palestine are inseparable, according to your argument, is there any justification for the existence of a field called Israel Studies, separate from Palestine? What is your take on that?
Thank you. Terrific question. When you say, is there any justification? Yes, of course. I can always think of a justification in terms of focus, building a community of scholars. But my own view, and has been for a number of years, is that it is time for an Israel-Palestine Studies Association. And I have talked to Palestinians, I have talked to Israelis, and intellectually, I can find no disagreement. The problem is political. I'm ready to start one. I'm ready to participate in starting one. Not others are less secure, or let's say more sensitive about reactions than I am. But it's clear to me that no matter how much the Israel Studies Association moves toward focus on Palestinian affairs as part of Israel, they will never treat sociology of hijab wearing in Nablus as a topic that they should be studying at the Association of Israel Studies. Yet, from my point of view, that's occurring in Israel and is probably affected by many things inside the Green Line. And the same thing is true, on the Palestinian side. You have the whole anti-normalization issue, which makes it very difficult for scholars on that side to think of participating in an Israel-Palestine Studies Association. But if you are interested, I stand ready to move forward with this idea. I think it is necessary to find Palestinian scholars who are willing to do it. I don't say that at the first go, the idea would be to replace the AIS and to replace Palestinian academic associations, but to add a new one. I definitely think that. So if you would rephrase your question and say, Ian, do you think that the Israel studies per se, or Palestine studies per se, is the best way to study events in this territory? My answer is no. It should be an Israel-Palestine Studies Association.
Yeah. Well, we will certainly continue this discussion after the talk.
Good.
And I want to take you back to the presentation, and maybe to bring the conversation to the reality on the ground in the past 10, 15 years. It's interesting. I heard last night on NPR Ehud Olmert, former Prime Minister of Israel, saying that no Prime Minister in the coming 50 years will be able to make the proposal that he had made in 2008 to the Palestinians to establish an independent Palestinian state. And as a historian, I can't really ask the what if question, but do you think that in 2008, and you talked about it in comparing the Secretary Kerry's statement in 2013, but do you think that in 2008 there was greater viability of the two-state solution, or we were already then in the one-state reality?
First of all, I don't see why, as a historian, you can't ask counterfactual questions. I don't see that at all. In fact, I don't see how you can really do history without asking. But that's an entirely different conversation. I've written done a lot of work on counterfactual. I have also looked carefully at the Olmert episode that you're referring to, 2008, 2009, very carefully. And I came to the conclusion, I've come to the conclusion that there was no there. It had almost no chance of success, mainly because, again, he was so weak. And he had no, and for the same reason why Otaba, after the collapse of Camp David, theoretically there was a picture there that might have guided, if Barak had any semblance of a coalition, to fall back on, but he didn't. Why? Because Israel had transformed, Israel had changed. So now I'm just a quick story. When I did my research for my book, my dissertation, Arabs and the Jewish State, I interviewed Ehud Olmert when he was a fresh-faced member of Knesset. Actually, I interviewed him in his attorney's office on Ben Yehuda Street. And I never forget, when I interviewed him, I was a skinny little graduate student from Berkeley. And I met and asking him these questions because he was responsible for commercial policy in the Arab, maybe from the Arab sector. All he wanted to do was show me his clippings from when he visited the United States, and he showed me pictures of him with all these famous people. He was so proud of it. And that showed me, wow, this is what a politician is like. He's so, and now he grew along with his wife into something a little more, but when he says there will be no independent Palestinian state, because he's right. When he's right. Now, I will qualify that in one way. In my book, I'm very careful to say that what is impossible is a negotiated two-state solution. That does not mean that sometime in the future, the West Bank and Gaza or parts of it could secede from Israel and become. That's how we have the state of Ireland. Britain annexed Ireland in 1800, and it took 120 years, but eventually the one-state reality gave birth to two states, because Ireland was partitioned after a world war and some other things. I see we have a question in Q&A.
Yeah, there is a question. Can you read the question?
Yes, I can. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Lustick. What do you make of the most recent apartheid analysis by Human Rights Watch? Would the one-state solution address the question of apartheid? In other words, would the one-state solution address Palestinian second-class status? Very good question. Yes, yes, yes. Of course, it's not just Human Rights Watch. It's actually Amnesty International and B'Tselem. There's a convergence on the use of the term apartheid. Now, let me talk about that term for a moment and then go to the question of the one-state reality and how it could evolve. Apartheid just means technically separation, but because it's so closely associated with the South African system of control over non-whites, when you say apartheid, you say, it sounds like you're saying this is just like South Africa. And Israel is not just like South Africa. It's like South Africa under apartheid in certain ways. For example, a dominant group subordinates a subordinated population that's very large and keeps it from enjoying freedoms, political equality, and a fair share of economic resources. That's for sure. Some of the tactics are the same, but the thing that marked the system of control that South Africa used was it was all explicitly in the law, proudly saying whites can do this, blacks can only do this. Israel has gone out of its way to avoid, in elaborately complicated administrative fashion, almost never having to say explicitly that we are discriminating against people on an ascriptive basis. So it's really a fundamental analytic error in that respect to call Israel apartheid. But the international community, taking advantage of the outrage associated with the word apartheid, introduced it as a legal term and gave it its own definition, which is not, apartheid is what they did in South Africa. Instead, apartheid is systematic discrimination on the basis of ascriptive characteristics. That definition applies to Israel, but it hasn't caught on as a meme the way the South African idea of apartheid is. So it's both true that Israel is an apartheid state if you're using the legal definition, and it's not true if you use the South African connotation. Now, so I use it in both ways, and I try to explain it. What we have in Israel now, you can call, using the international version, silent apartheid. That is, this is a systematic discrimination against almost half the population who live between the river and the sea that is not called what it is. And it's much more complicated because you have a different system in the West Bank than you do in East Jerusalem. You have a different system in East Jerusalem than you do in Gaza. You have a different system in the Negev and the Galilee than you have in those other areas. But in all the systems, you have a system of castes and a system of zones that interact and create a much more complicated. But now, how is the one-state reality? You've heard the term democratization. What we really have here is a question of democratization. How does a state, which is not democratic or is only partially democratic, because South Africa was partially democratic, whites had full democratic rights. They had elections, and those elections changed governments, they had political parties. All you had to do was be white. Well, in Israel, all you have to do is be Jewish, or not Arab is actually the point. So the question is, how does a country like Israel democratize? There are two forms of democratization. There's the Latin American, Eastern European form, where overnight the Iron Curtain falls, the dictator is overthrown, and boom, you got a democracy. Okay, you shift from a military junta to a democracy, you have an election, boom, everything's fine. That's when the whole system flips from democracy, from autocracy to democracy, and it can flip back. We've seen that too. We're seeing that in Russia. We've maybe seen it in other places as well. But when you have the kind of democratization problem you have in Israel, it's very different. The United States was formed with a huge Black population that were slaves. Even when they stopped being slaves, they didn't have equal political rights. They hardly had any rights. Women, half the population, were not allowed to vote for a century and a half. How did those democratization processes occur? They didn't occur overnight. They occurred slowly, partially because Blacks and women, not only in the United States, but Irish Catholics in Britain or women in France, they made demands for equality, but ultimately those demands themselves didn't lead to the emancipation. Democratization came because the incumbents, the whites, the men, the Protestants, were fighting with one another. And incumbents were worried that they might lose the next election, saw in the women or in the Blacks possible voters. That's how that centripetal process in politics, that's how democracy works. Democracy is a dirty business. It's better than anything else, but it's really dirty. But one of the nice things about it is that people will do anything not to lose. Anything. Even call someone that you said was a traitor and a devil, now a hero. That's what happened to Mansour Abbas. That's the beauty of, so in the long run, when you have a system of a one-state reality in which there are all these potential voters, they will eventually get drawn in. That will eventually happen, but it will take not decades, it will take generations. That's what I mean by the different form of democratization that's occurring when you are dealing not with flipping the government, but incorporating huge populations that have been historically treated as suspect, inferior, or terrifying.
I think that the one exception would be the Zionist left that prefers to lose rather than cooperating with the joint list or.
Well, let's look at that for a moment. First of all, there are a significant number of Jewish voters for the joint list, maybe more than 10,000. And I think that it wouldn't surprise me if Mansour Abbas gets some votes from Jews in the next election. But aside from that, there are signs on the left of a realization that the one-state reality requires drastic change. One of the things that changes is you don't find the demographic argument used so much anymore. You can't use the demographic argument. That is, how you don't want to live with Arabs. They're dirty, they're lazy, they're scary. Just get out of the West Bank. Well, you can't say those things about Arabs if you need Arab votes to win. And that's what the left desperately needs. So actually, the left does not talk, and Peace Now does not talk about the demographic issue anywhere like it used to talk about it. That's now, So, Lior, look for change like that. Look for straws in the wind. Look at how J Street raises money now, not so explicitly because it says otherwise the two-state solution will be impossible. It's less saying that and more talking about just general ideas of peace and democracy, because it sees the landscape has changed. So there are little straws in the wind. You have to see how this one-state reality is evolving.
I want to get back to Mansour Abbas and Bennett later, but we have a question, another attempt from Farzin. Farzin, you can now unmute yourself.
Please unmute yourself. She's not. How about if she writes her question in the Q&A?
Yeah, you can write a question maybe, Farzin. So until she does it, I can relate to the term apartheid and connect it to this list of prediction that we are going to lose the two-state solution that Ian, you put in the beginning from Amos Elon and others. That already in 1976, Yitzhak Rabin said, if we continue this way, it will be an apartheid, which is basically stating that we are going to a one-state solution. So it was Rabin himself, and then at a very early point in history. And I think it is remarkable in this regard.
Yes. Yep. Well, Israeli leaders have said a lot of remarkable things. And even if we leave Ben-Gurion aside, who literally said everything, there's nothing at a single position I can think of that Ben-Gurion didn't take at one point or another. But, you know, Barak said if he had been an Arab, you would have been Hamas. I mean, Israeli leaders have said some remarkable things.
Yeah. And about the flexibility of public opinion, Leo, in the week after Ayman Odeh and the Joint List decided to recommend Benny Gantz for being prime minister, a poll showed that 72% of the center-left voters wanted to see the Joint List in the coalition.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, if you can send me, I'd love to see that article, because that's the kind of thing I put up on my website to show just how much malleability there is for things you might not otherwise imagine.
I think that the politicians are far more scared of it than the voters. It's not. I think that they are afraid to be labeled as collaborators of Arabs, or you know, the many variants of this saying in Hebrew. Yes. I just want to ask. You know, we talked about Mansour Abbas, and what is the current formation of a prime minister that never believed, and he was very open about it, never believed in two-state solution, didn't want to talk about one-state solution, preferred the status quo with some amendments, and going together with Mansour Abbas, who decided to leave aside the Palestinian issue altogether. How do you see it, you know, aligning with your model and with?
I think very well, actually. You know, Mansour Abbas's position is the same really as Nimr Darwish before, the Sheikh Darwish. And that is, look, we Muslims dominate the region. We are the strong ones. In the long run, you Jews have the problem. If you're nice to us, we will allow you to live here. But in the meantime, we have to deal with the reality that you have all this power, and we will. But we are the confident ones. You're the scared ones. So the crucial point is, once you take this long view, this generational view, then you can afford to play politics. And you don't have to worry, oh, it's a Jewish state, I'm going to legitimize it. No, you don't have to worry about that. And that's what he's doing. And so from my point of view, one of the things I'm advocating is to change our time frame, to think in decades and generations. That's how these kinds of problems change. If you keep thinking in months and years, you're trapped in a embedding the silent apartheid deeper and deeper. something that no one loves, but many people would prefer to an open struggle for democracy. Benny Gantz is a great example. And so is probably Lapid. So is Livnet. You have to continue to pretend that there's a two-state solution possibly around the corner, which you can't rule out because otherwise you have to talk democracy. And God forbid, chas v'chalila, you have to have the Arabs in the democracy. So that's what I see the real problem of the it's the ghost of the two-state solution that exists, not itself, and it's doing damage.
Thank you very much. I think that we have to conclude. We really appreciate your coming today and your presentation. And thank you to the audience who joined us. And we'll post this conversation on our YouTube channel. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Lior. Thank you, Tamir. And Farzan, if you can hear me, send me your question. I'd be glad to respond to it in an email. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Ian, just